In the heart of Africa, a river guide faces his worst nightmare. Leading a tour down the Zambezi River, everything changed in an instant. A monstrous hippo attacked, dragging Paul into a terrifying fight for survival. How does a man survive an attack from one of Earth's largest creatures? This is the story of Paul Templar, a man who stared death in the face and lived to tell the tale. March 9th, 1996 was the date on which Paul had, as he puts it, a bad day at the office. Paul was working as canoe safari guide in Zimbabwe, spending his days guiding tourists down the Zambezi River. He'd point out all of Africa's incredible wildlife: elephants, lions, giraffes, crocs, and of course hippos.
I could go with the cliché. It was a day that started like any other, but it didn't. It started with a sense of foreboding.
Paul recalled.
A friend of mine who was supposed to be leading a canoe safari had come down with malaria. You know, when you have that feeling of trepidation, like something's just not the way it's supposed to be? That's how I felt. But the opportunity to take that safari was fantastic. It was on one of the most beautiful stretches of river, maybe in the world.
Paul said. He loved canoeing down the river and sharing his knowledge with the tourist.
Things were going pretty well. And we came across a pod of about a dozen hippos, just wallowing in the shallows. So I pulled up next to them. We look at the hippos. We start talking about hippos. Of course, there's always someone on a safari who asks if it's true that hippos kill more people every year than any other animal. The answer is yes. So that's why we're gonna stay away from them. Let's go around them.
Paul had 7 canoes on his safari, 3 filled with tourists, the other 4 by Paul and 3 apprentice guides, Evans, Ben, and Mike. The canoe piloted by Evans was knocked off course and into deeper water. Suddenly there was a deafening thud, and Paul knew exactly what had happened. A giant bull hippo had charged at the young guide's canoe.
I turned just in time to see the canoe about 4 feet out of the water, and the guide was catapulted into the river. I thought, that's not good, and I told my clients to paddle back to safety, and I moved towards Evans. I'm like, hey, hang in there. I'm coming to get you. He looks at me and he's got panic in his eyes. So I'm reaching over, and it was like a made-for-Hollywood moment.
Paul's heart raced. He suddenly had to become a hero, like he was in some kind of an action movie.
He's reaching out of the water, and as our fingers almost touch, the water suddenly explodes and everything goes dark. I'm somewhere deep and dark and dank. I'm trying to move, but I can't, but my legs are moving around.
Paul suddenly realizes he's being swallowed by a hippo.
From my waist up, I'm not dry, but I'm not wet. I get one hand free, and I can feel the bristles on a hippo's snout. So now I know where I am. It was slimy, slippery, wet. It smelled like a rotten egg. I'm so far down his throat, and I'm not a small guy. So I managed to grab a hold of the tusks and push myself out and burst to the surface. I've been underwater a while. But I come up and am face to face with the guide I'm trying to rescue, and say, we really need to get out of here. So I start swimming for safety, but I looked back at Evans, and he wasn't going anywhere. His eyes were like saucers. He tried to stay afloat, but I think adrenaline literally overwhelmed him.
But the hippo wasn't done with Paul yet.
So I turned and swam back for him, and just as I'm moving in to grab his hand, I'm hit from below. So once again, I'm up to my waist down the hippo's throat. The hippo is just thrashing me around. The hippo spits me out again and I start swimming. I'm making pretty good progress.
Just as Paul thinks he is about to make it to shore, he's met by the hippo again.
But then I just see the giant bull hippo charging towards me with his mouth wide open. He scores a direct hit and he chomps down. This time my head, neck and shoulders are outside one side of his mouth, and from my waist down is outside the other. He just goes berserk. I remember at one point he threw me up into the air and I did a crazy sort of half twist. And when I fell back and he caught me in his mouth, but so hard that I thought he was gonna chop me in half.
One of the clients said it was like watching a vicious dog trying to rip apart a rag doll.
For me, Everything was going in slow motion, which was really quite fortunate as I could think it through. I could think, okay, hold on to the tusks. Because I had hippo tusks boring through me, and I figured out if I held onto them, then my flesh didn't tear so much. When he took me underwater, I could hold my breath, and when I came to the surface, I would breathe deeply.
This carried on for a bit, and then the hippo got tired and dived for deep water. I remember lying at the bottom of the river, realizing I was wedged inside the hippo's mouth.
Looking up, I can see green and blue in the sunlight on the water surface, and when I look around, I can see my blood mingling with the water.
Paul knew he was bleeding pretty bad, but didn't know how bad his injuries were.
I just remember thinking, I wonder if I'm going to bleed to death, or if I'm going to drown. It was just a very matter of fact. Could me or the hippo hold their breath the longest? Suddenly, the hippo lurched towards the surface and spat me out again.
This time, fellow guide Mike in the safety kayak showed incredible courage.
He paddled in, and I managed to get up and into the kayak. Now the hippo couldn't climb up after us. So that was the front end of a pretty bad day at the office.
Apprentice guide Mike did what he could to patch Paul up by tearing up some shirts and performing basic emergency first aid. Meanwhile, Ben, the other guide, paddled off to find Evans, but it was dark, and then there was no sign of him. The chances of anyone coming to look for Paul, Evans, and the tour group were slim. Paul's blood was flowing by this point, filling up the bottom of the canoe as the bull hippo kept bumping against it. Paul says the pain was excruciating, and he knew there was a life or death decision he had to make.
I had to decide, do I stay or do I go? Do I shut my eyes and just drift off, call it a day? Or do I keep my eyes open and fight my way through it? I kind of had this incredible sense of peace beyond anything I could ever experience. So I made my choice to carry on, and the second I made that choice, oh my word, my body was infused with more pain than I ever thought a body could handle. The pain was so intense that I wished I'd made the other choice, to die. But by then, I didn't seem to have that option.
The tour group made it to the shore, but were a man down. Evans was gone. They found his body 2 days later, but without a scratch on him. The young guide had drowned. Paul had 38 major bite wounds, and left his arm from the elbow down had been crushed to a pulp. Paul would live to tell his story, but would lose his arm.